order or chaos, or the third way, how the options of life seem to the typical modern, perpetual, adolescent. Bruce Charlton. I suspect that, in very general terms, the modern materialist mainstream person, whose attitudes are, unless they are very young, essentially adolescent, sees life as a choice, in practice always a compromise, between the possibilities of order and chaos. Order and chaos are given institutional form in bureaucracy versus the mass media, realism v idealism, ideology v instinct, optimal outcomes for society over the longer term v myself in the short term, or globalist totalitarianism versus sexual, and other, gratifications unrestrained. There is some basis of truth, and indeed good, in both of these extremes, which is why they have appeal and sufficient surface plausibility to be a life goal. Yet, as goals, both extremes are alike impossible to implement, and lead to misery when attempted, while any compromise, while more sustainable, is doubly unsatisfying on both sides, in both directions. I would have thought it obvious that neither of these options, nor any combination or middle way between them, is actually a good life, but the problem is that these are implicitly regarded as the only possible options, which is why the order v chaos dichotomy appears in so many guises, and so many places in modern society. Clearly we must have a third way, which is hierarchically above both order and chaos, or their manifestations, and this third way is the path following Jesus Christ and leading into resurrected eternal life in heaven. It is a path by which love and creativity in mortal life is carried forward to divine life in a divine society. The third way is what enables someone to look above and beyond the merely temporary satisfactions and compromises of this mortal life, but which also enables the utmost value to derive from the choices and actions, including thoughts, of this mortal life. However, the existence of this third way is outside the allowed realities of materialism. The third is, in short, a spiritual way, and therefore excluded by assumption from all the discourses of modernity. This means that it is very difficult, and in the short term often impossible, to describe and offer the third option as a realistic, here and now and forever path to a typically materialist adolescent-minded modern person. Modern people simply won't believe the third way is possible, and cannot therefore get into a position of choosing it. I suppose that this is why the modern world is what it is, and going where it is going. Having refused even to acknowledge the possibility and reality of the third way, the West is following out the consequences of this rejection to its bitter end. Those who choose order and totalitarianism are seeing their plans sabotaged by those whose allegiance is to chaos and hedonism, while, in order to survive and have power, the hedonists are required to sustain a miserable and anti-life system of totalitarianism, while the would-be moderates are buffeted to and fro, and their lives wrecked by the oscillations and clashes of the extremes. Having rejected outright the chance to learn from and choose between life experiences of mortality, our civilization has chosen, and is getting, some very tough, very harsh lessons regarding the inevitable misery and meaninglessness of a life of materialism. Both as individuals, and perhaps collectively, modern men are being confronted by the fact that a life without purpose or meaning is a mere existence, and for most people, most of the time, such an existence is intolerable to contemplate, and can be dealt with only by refusing to contemplate it, by self-impairment with distraction, drugs, or whatever effectively prevents thought. Note: the characteristic mainstream modern intellectual is, whatever his supposed function, some kind of manager, and the characteristic mindset of such persons is precisely to oscillate between a rigidly bureaucratic, servile to superiors / arrogant to subordinates, anti-individual, anti-human professional life, and an ideology of extreme leftist radicalism rooted in a kind of deification of some individuals, who represent and are conceptualized in terms of oppressed groups. The oscillation is often manifested as an individual, with a persona of obedient officialdom at work, but with transgressive sex, alcohol and drug intoxication outside of work. Another oscillation is when there are unprincipled exceptions to bureaucratic rules and laws granted to favored persons, alternating with progressively ever-increasing surveillance and control of individuals and subordination of private behaviors to bureaucratic imperatives. How are things going, on the whole? Bruce Charlton. A couple of observations. In geopolitics, it is clear that the Western world is increasingly dominated in its major policies by agents of sorothic destruction. They have set up the global situation such that a full-on Third World War is little more than a hair's breadth away. On the flip side, at the time of writing it has not happened. While the world has been poised and teetering ever closer to the edge of a precipice for the past 21 months or so, the nations have not yet thrown themselves off it, despite quite extraordinary provocations. This must, I think, mean that there are powerful agents who do not want all-in world war. What I am unsure about is whether these agents of restraint are positively motivated by good in any shape or form, or whether they merely favor the less violent evil of international totalitarianism, with its omni-surveillance and complete mind control, and that they recognize that achieving this goal would be disrupted by major wars, and so are holding back the destruction merchants from irreversible escalation. Another possibility is that plans of any kind are constantly being subverted by the selfish short-termism of those tasked with their implementation. For example, instead of following the strategy of making war, the agents are tempted and distracted into making money. Still, what we are seeing is at least consistent with the operation of covert good motivations that, to an extent, counteract the much more obvious and explicit evil for the major leadership class. Further, when it comes to individuals, my impression, and that is all it can be, is that the side of good continues to lose people. As the system continues to bring forward more and more litmus test issues, it seems that each new wave of challenges is failed by a significant proportion of those Christians who had previously been stalwart. Indeed, claims of an exclusive, church-based Christianity has now itself become a litmus test. To believe that Christianity must be institutional, is to fall into the hands of totalitarianism, since they now control the entire institutional framework of the West. For instance, whereas I hoped that the post-2020 situation might lead to an alliance of serious Christians of all denominations, and none, this has not happened. Way too many Christians still expend far too much energy denigrating other types of Christian, and denying, what they call proving, that those out with their chosen church/denomination are Christians at all. Religious definitions and rules have often become more strict, literal and communally defined and enforced, as a way of trying to prevent liberalizing slippage. Thus these forward church Christians become focused on institutional survival and thriving in an increasingly hostile environment, instead of engaging in the spiritual war. Those who respond to the triumphant evil of this world by putting all their faith into obedience to any this world institution, including any church, have become captives to this world, and have made an advance vow to follow this world where it may lead, insofar as this world control the institution. In effect, each self-identified Christian church asserts a formula for maintaining its faithfulness to God's wishes. But, because the church is an institution that exists at the social level, the formula takes some publicly observable, publicly enforceable form. And that is how the system is able to penetrate and corrupts all institutions. Only our consciousness and chosen personal relationships stand outside the system, all institutions are inside it. There is no doubt that the modern world, especially in the West, is a harsh examination, and there is no formula for success, because formulae are exactly the mechanism by which corruption is operative. This is a problem of any essentially defensive strategy. If it succeeds, then things stay the same, if it loses, then they get worse. People may default from defense, but defense can never be victorious. On the other hand, any positive attitude that depends on institutions, any materially positive strategy, will sooner or later be corrupted by the system. The answer is to be individually and spiritually positive, and to find a way of doing this that does not ultimately depend on other people. In case it isn't clear, I became a Christian for the wrong reasons. Mostly. Bruce Charlton. I've said this several times in several places over the past 10+ years on this blog, but maybe it deserves stating on its own. When I converted to Christianity, when I became a Christian, it was for the wrong reasons. Mostly. My reasons for believing in first God, and then Jesus Christ, were, mostly, but not entirely social and civilizational. This was because I had been brought to the point of conversion by the societal decline of England, and the West generally. I realized that my civilization had become at first weak, then self-loathing, because we had deleted God personally and from public discourse, and in doing so deleted all possibility of purpose and meaning in life. Having believed in God, i.e. becoming a theist, I then became a Christian, believing that Christianity was the truest of all the religions I knew. But I was unsure of the right denomination to join. What I was looking for, then, was civilizational level changes such as purpose, meaning and the basis for social cohesion in support of the transcendental values, truth, beauty and virtue. I then embarked on exploring, trying, a variety of denominations, even while I could see them collapsing in real time, almost in front of my eyes. Or more likely I gradually saw that the Western churches shared the weakness and indeed self-hatred of the civilization in general. I sought holiness, but found only legalism and a hard kind of strictness. From here and now, looking back on my recent life, it seems obvious that I was, substantially, albeit not fully, regarding Christianity and its churches as a means to a materialistic end, the awakening and regeneration of the West in general, England in particular. I never regarded this as an optimistic desire, indeed it never seemed probable that it would actually happen, but I saw a Christian revival as the only legitimate hope. But then I began to realize that my hope for a revival of traditional, old-time religion and strong churches was not just futile, in the sense that the opposite was happening, but that it would not be the answer even if it did happen. In other words, that my hope, even if fulfilled, was not legitimate. I began to realize that Christianity had departed the churches, and they had become mere shells of institutions, in the same way as schools, hospitals, the police, law courts and military were just shells, which is that they retain forms and rules but without the motivating spirit. Insofar as there was still a motivating Christian spirit in the churches, it came from low down the hierarchy, it was dwindling, and it was ignored or persecuted, i.e. a situation exactly analogous to what I had observed in science and medicine a decade earlier. That is where I currently am. I now believe that I became a Christian for many wrong reasons to do with what I hoped that, in principle, Christianity, or else one or more of the Christian churches, could do for Western civilization. I first realized that this could not happen, because the churches had institutionally lost their core spiritual motivations, and then I realized that even if the churches had remained uncorrupt, none of the earlier institutional forms of Christianity were capable, even theoretically, of addressing the major spiritual necessities of the West here and now. Liberalism had failed, but traditionalism could not work, even if it appeared to revive, which it didn't. Another way of describing the trajectory, is that it took me quite a while to get clear about what Christianity really is, and always was. After all, across the centuries, Christianity has been and has included many, many things, even if we confine attention to a single denomination. At the most basic level, there has been, and is, tremendous ambiguity, unclarity, confusion and contradiction about what Jesus actually did. What, in other words, salvation actually means. This, of itself, was something that took a great deal of sorting out, and indeed it could not be sorted out until I had re-examined several assumptions that I had absorbed without sufficient clarity or evaluation. I do not think I really understood this, at least not enough to be clear enough to be able to defend it and advocate it as an individual, until my long and focused reading of the fourth gospel. This eventually, a decade after I became a Christian, made me see that the simple and true essence of Christianity had been obscured by the high volume of secondary, and erroneous, doctrine and theology that, apparently, began accumulating from very soon after Jesus' resurrection. It now seems to me that the reason why the Christian churches are not, cannot, and should not be the basis for a Christian revival, is that none of them have a clear and simple grasp of the core and essence of Christianity. This did not much matter in the past, in that the whole package did contain the truth, along with a lot of other stuff, and because people accepted the whole package, and because society as a whole was not actively evil. Now we have a world in which everybody picks and chooses in their religions, even especially when they deny this, when the world as a whole is actively evil, and therefore where Christians absolutely need to be clear about what it is that we believe and why. Nobody is going to tell us what we need to know, so we must each work it out for himself, and take responsibility for what he concludes. We each need to discover for ourselves what it really is to be a Christian, and to choose that Christianity, choose for the right reason/s. Anything else is not going to last, as the world darkens. But the right choice will last, and will strengthen, whatever happens to the world. Behind the scenes, spiritual guides. William Wildblood. It's possible that some readers of this blog who have only come to it recently are not aware of its initiating inspiration, referred to in the title of the blog. I am not saying the writings here have any special authority. For better or worse they are just me, but they do derive in part from experiences I had as a young man when I was given instruction by beings from the spiritual world who are traditionally referred to as masters. The word describes souls who have mastered their lower nature, overcome the world, the flesh and the devil, and passed out of the ordinary human kingdom into the fifth kingdom, that of souls united in full consciousness with God. In Christian terminology this would be souls who have achieved theosis, which is very different to salvation, as it implies that the soul has not just turned to God but has actually made the spiritual journey that leads to the divinization of consciousness. Here's the difference. Salvation means to follow Christ. Theosis is to become like him in the sense of allowing him to be born and grow to maturity in your heart. This is a long and arduous process, but the saints and other great spiritual figures of the past have proved it can be done by those prepared to make the necessary sacrifice of the earthly self. That is what the crucifixion means. There follows an article, slightly edited, from my book The Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man, which explains something about these masters. I know some people are suspicious of such beings, fearing demonic deception, but we should not let the existence of fake coin blind us to the reality of authentic currency. At the same time, deception assuredly does exist, but that is what we have intuition for, to sort out true from false. What are masters? In this article, I hope to shed some light on the idea of discarnate spiritual masters as the enlightened guides of humanity, and to set out what they are and what they are not. This is an area in which there is a lot of illusion and confusion. The purpose of the article is to show why that is so and to clarify, for believer and skeptic alike, what remains a difficult subject. For over 100 years now the idea of spiritual masters has been well established in Western esoteric thought and, one might add, myth. These are alleged to be beings who have gone beyond the need for the human experience and now exist in a state of elevated consciousness, free of the limitations of material form as we know it. They have realized their oneness with God. The Theosophical Mahatmas were probably the first of these masters to be presented to the general public, but many other groups and individuals have claimed contact with similar or identical beings since, and there are a number of teachings, received in various ways, supposedly deriving from them. Some of these teachings can be spiritually instructive. Others are clearly false. What is the reality behind all this, if indeed there is one? The masters as presented by the Theosophists started off as flesh and blood figures, enlightened but physically incarnate though dwelling in Himalayan remoteness. Recent research has suggested that they may originally have been based on actual people encountered by Madame Blavatsky on her wanderings, people she then used as models for the masters who would therefore be largely her creation, in appearance at least. But that's certainly not how they were thought of at the time, and subsequent theosophical leaders expanded on the original picture of the masters considerably, elevating them to almost Christ-like figures, which is slightly odd since they were essentially Buddhists. They promoted the young Krishnamurti as their intended mouthpiece, only to be discomfited when he rejected the position intended for him, apparently turning his back on the whole idea of masters. However, the concept of spiritual supermen did not go away. It was taken up by other groups and is now an intrinsic part of New Age thought, with a variety of channeled communications purportedly emanating from what has come to be called the spiritual hierarchy. For the interested layperson, separating fact from fiction in all this can be something of a challenge. You might think that either such masters exist or they don't exist, but it's not quite that straightforward. In a famous passage, Dion Fortune said, "The masters as you picture them are all imagination." I did not say that the masters were imagination, but the masters as they are supposed to be in popular would-be esoteric thought are pure fiction. This remark makes clear that the masters are real, but they are not as we think they are, or as presented by some of those claiming to represent them. This does not necessarily mean that such people are deliberately misleading us, and to understand why this is so we have to understand something of the composition of the higher worlds from whence these people say they derive their inspiration. Esoteric thought tells us that between the physical and purely spiritual worlds there exists a realm corresponding to the human psyche, which is often called the astral plane. This is non-physical but still material in that it is a plane of form and multiplicity. It has no permanent reality but is formed of the wishes, desires and thoughts of human beings built up over thousands of years. It is the world to which belong the emotions and the imaginative impulses of humanity, and, significantly for our topic, the substance of which it is formed is readily responsive to thought. What this means is that the psychically sensitive person can either create, through imagination and aspiration, an image of a master, or else tune into a pre-existing one. If he lacks spiritual discernment, he may mistake the image for the reality. This image or thought form is not inert like a statue, but may acquire a kind of life of its own. It may be capable of giving teachings that reflect its creator's already existing spiritual knowledge and thus give the impression of a certain attainment. This is one source of confusion, one that relates to the imagination spoken of by Dion Fortune, but the matter is further complicated by the fact that there exist on this astral plane disembodied beings who may pose as, or even consider themselves to be, masters. These beings may have a sophisticated knowledge of the inner worlds, but that does not mean they have transcended identification with the ego self, which would be the case with a genuine master. This is why they still function at lower levels. They may give teachings which to the intellect seem good and true, but which will lack the transformative impulse that would come from one who might give similar teachings having personally realized their essence. Moreover, these lesser teachings will always contain flaws that act like vinegar in milk, souring the whole. The masters are not focused in the psychic worlds. They are not, except in the rarest of cases, the beings that communicate through channeling. Their field of operation is the spiritual world, which transcends the phenomenal realms of change and multiplicity of which the psychic is still a part. Only very seldom do they descend below this level. They are not the exotically named, and elaborately titled figures of occult fantasy. What then are they? They are men made perfect who have overcome all attachments to the material world and, putting the matter in good old-fashioned terms, cleansed their souls of sin. They are human souls, like us, but they are at one with their source in God as we are not. For them the earthly mind is no longer the focal point of consciousness but that which gives form to consciousness, and their teachings and methods of teaching reflect this reality. Hence, their preferred means of communication is not mind to mind but soul to soul, which is to say, on an intuitive rather than a mental level, through impression not words. They teach spirituality spiritually. Now this does not mean that the masters never communicate more directly. Most certainly not everything that is claimed to emanate from them does so, but there are occasions when they approach incarnate humanity on a less rarefied level, and a small number of teachings have been transmitted that do bear their imprint. It is not for me to say what may or may not be authentic. That is something we must work out for ourselves, since this is how we develop spiritual discernment, and the awakening of the mind in the heart is the principal goal of all spiritual endeavor. One thing I would say though. The masters teach of and from the soul, by which I mean the spiritual component of our being which exists beyond form and the mind as normally conceived. They certainly do not deny the individual, but the bedrock of their teaching is that we should forget our everyday, earthly self, the ego, and strive to live in God. Any teaching which does not have this at its heart is not from them. If we would hear the Master's voice, we must learn to step out of the worldly mind and disentangle ourselves from attachment to material things, not just objects but ideas as well. If we wish to respond to the true Masters and not their astral reflection, then we must subdue what relates to the astral plane within us, self-centered desire, wishful thinking, preconceived ideas and the like. We must be able to remain faithful to the highest that is within us regardless of pressures from outside, which can take many forms and include even the apparently wise. What motivates the Masters as teachers is love. If we can summon up in ourselves just a fraction of that love, they can draw near to us. We may not be consciously aware of their presence, but they will be able to inspire us and bring us into a closer union with our own soul, which, after all, is the real goal of the spiritual path. Christians who are dubious about such matters should know that this is just another term for the company of saints. We should certainly be alert to demonic deception as we should to fake gurus in the spiritual world, of whom there are plenty. We should always ask how much of the Spirit of Christ is present here. The advice given by St. John in chapter 4 of his first epistle remains the touchstone. Hope is the antidote to despair, but it can also be a double-edged sword. Francis Berger. Let us contemplate Sartre's dictum that life begins beyond despair. Note the word beyond. Assume it means on the far side of or the other side of. Assume beyond also means far away from and out with. With this in mind, two potential paths to living beyond despair become apparent. The first involves encountering despair and overcoming it with spiritual hope. The second entails avoiding or shunning despair altogether by utilizing temporal hope. Considering the nature and reality of mortal life, the first path appears less common, at least when it comes to contending with despair spiritually. The second, though possible, seems idealistic, perhaps even false. After all, how would one even know one is beyond despair if one claims to have never experienced it or leaves no space for it due to elevated optimism and hope for this world? Hope is the universally prescribed antidote for despair, but what kind of hope can dispel despair and propel one beyond it to the beginning of life? Vanquishing despair with hope can be a double-edged sword. We all know that the devil tempts toward despair, but many seem to have forgotten that the devil can also tempt with hope. For example, relying on predominantly temporal hopes may provide Christians with unfathomable optimism and many reasons to live, struggle, fight, organize, and build. However, hope, based primarily on churches, societies, culture, and civilization may also distance them from the real hope Christ offers. If the devil can provide Christians with enough worldly hope and get them invested in enough reasons to live in the world and for the world, then he knows he may succeed at getting Christians to regard the hope Christ offers as secondary. On top of that, the more the devil succeeds in grounding Christian hopes firmly in this world, the more chance he has at dashing those hopes when the temporal inevitably succumbs to entropy and death. From a Christian perspective, living beyond despair demands that we face despair sincerely, that is, spiritually, and work to overcome it via inner transformation guided by the hope Jesus offers. For Christians, the orientation of this transformation must be next worldly. This kind of hope-inspired transformation can overcome this worldly despair and help place one beyond its clutches. Some might consider such next worldly hope to be lopsided in its focus and may even complain that it makes Christians passive and complacent about worldly affairs. Nothing could be further from the truth. When Christians vanquish temporal despair with spiritual hope, they do not turn their backs on the world. They turn and face the world from the transformed viewpoint of a new life beyond despair. Analyzing what women do is. What women do, Hospital Society Signs of Maladaptive Mutation Accumulation. Bruce Charlton. In the weird online world, the masculine reaction against feminism and feminization has often taken the form of men analyzing what women do, in order, supposedly, for men to be able better to understand and manipulate women. So, men who purport to desire to re-establish patriarchy, are expending their time and efforts in discussing the opposite sex. And yet, this kind of thing is exactly what women do. Back in the day when men were men would never dream of getting together to analyze women, they were just not interested in such gossip. Men, instead, wanted to talk about things that interested them: work, sports, politics, theology. That was even the case just 20 plus years ago, when Robin Dunbar was researching his book Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language. In his studies, eavesdropping on single-sex groups chatting, men talked about their interests, while women talked about social stuff, mostly about men. There was, indeed, a whole evolutionary rationale for this difference in subject matter, to which I made a small contribution. Indirectly, the biological evidence was that such different interests were broadly adaptive. That is, such differences led to enhanced reproductive success throughout past evolutionary history. In traditional societies, it was a better reproductive strategy, overall, on average, for men to focus their social interactions on the world, and women to focus on people, especially men. Therefore, I would regard men analyzing women as a hospital society phenomenon, consistent with dedifferentiation, loss of sexual differentiation, and maladaptation, loss of social and sexual adaptations, which are plausibly caused by mutation accumulation. Of course, this does not mean that it is wrong for groups of men to want to analyze women in their online gossip, or IRL, especially considering that the West 2023 is not our environment of evolutionary adaptedness. Just that such behavior is rather effeminate. Thus paradoxically, the modern pro-masculine reaction is in this, as in other respects, unmasculine. Briefly to summarize and caricature, men spontaneously talk about men, and so do women. Christians, and, even more so, Christian churches, need a clean break from doing worldly good. Bruce Charlton. I would say that there are no Christian duties in this world relating to matters such as feeding the poor, promoting peace, preserving the earth, and such like social work. This applies even when such charitable activity is genuine, as it usually is not, when the poor being fed really are poor, when genuine peace is being promoted rather than, in fact, war supported, when it is nature genuinely is being protected, rather than funding multinational fake sustainable technologies, etc. I mean that Christians ought to stop trying to help people physically, materially, to cease aiming at a happier and healthier world, to give up on plans to diminish here and now human suffering caused by social problems and injustices. We have reached a situation from which Christianity must detach itself entirely from all such worldly generic duties, projects etc. because these will be used against Christianity by Antichrist powers, and will always be expanded to crowd out the genuine spiritual, and next worldly orientated duties. This world and the here and now will always, and especially to the typical modern mind, seem primary, urgent and imperative, compared with the easy way that next word and eternal requirements can be delayed, postponed, and made secondary. From where we now are, with the priorities and motivations and pressures that we now have, Christians should not acknowledge that any worldly actions are specifically Christian and mandatory to Christians. Of course, we will all continue personally to do specific acts as a matter of our personal love, sense of duty etc., but these cannot be allowed to be imperative as abstract generalizations. Churches need to do the same, and ought to focus primarily on whatever they regard as spiritual imperatives, or else we will continually repeat the 2020 situation in which the major churches all ceased to offer their spiritual services, while continuing their social services. As one representative example, in April of 2020 during the pandemic lockdowns, the Church of England's churches were allowed, by the bishop's instructions, to open and be used for use as food banks and PEC centers, while all sacramental activity in the same buildings was forbidden. Analogous actions were taken by all major Christian churches, revealing their true priorities were almost exclusively material, expedient, and totalitarian compatible. The only way out and forward from burial beneath the vast complex of wrong motivations and false priorities and confused intentions that led to such appalling practices, in so many churches, is a clean break. Only from a ground zero position of complete spiritual freedom from the currently suffocating network of worldly entanglements and social responsibilities, can properly Christian motivations be rediscovered and renewed. Only after we have solidly established the priority of the spiritual, may we then choose to rebuild a selective and effective concern with the material. Adapted from a comment on Francis Berger's blog. Reply to GunnerQ. William Wildblood. A blogger called GunnerQ has responded to my last post about the Masters. He was not impressed. As matter of fact, I don't actually disagree with a lot of what he says. The original article was one I wrote some years ago when I was more of a universalist than I am now and expressed myself a little differently to how I would today. At the same time, I do stand by the essentials of what the article says. There are spiritual beings who have won through the travails and tests of this world, and they do stand ready to help those who are receptive to their impression. There are demons and imposters too, no doubt about that, and they are probably more readily accessible to the psychically inclined, but why should we let the reality of lies deter us from the fact of truth? GunnerQ quotes a few sections from the article and comments on them, so I will do the same. He takes this passage. The word, master, describes souls who have mastered their lower nature, overcome the world, the flesh and the devil, and passed out of the ordinary human kingdom into the fifth kingdom, that of souls united in full consciousness with God. He responds that we need a savior because we cannot master ourselves and overcome the world. If you don't know this, then have you even tried to be good? I know what he means and he's not wrong, but he has misunderstood me, or I have expressed myself badly, or perhaps we are just coming at things from a slightly different perspective. We assuredly cannot attain any kind of spiritual perfection by our own efforts. All comes from grace. However, it is by our own efforts that we make ourselves able to receive grace through purification of the heart and mind. That's surely standard Christian doctrine. Mastering the lower nature means controlling anger, lust, tendency to lie, etc., obeying the 10 Commandments and the injunctions to love God and love our neighbor. It means living a life of faith, hope and charity rather than one of disbelief, greed and selfishness. It's tilling the soil, but obviously only God can plant the seed. Still, the ground must be well prepared if the seed is to grow as it should. He doesn't like the phrase divinization of consciousness. Again, I take his point. It's a clumsy phrase, and many seekers after higher consciousness are indulging in the satanic attempt to be spiritual without God. On the other hand, there clearly is higher consciousness. To think we will be as we are now when we reach heaven makes no sense at all. Heaven is not just a pretty place. That's the paradise of the other big religion. GunnerQ also doesn't like the idea of achieving theosis. Fair enough, if it's taken to mean doing that by one's own efforts, but that's not how I meant it or how it would be understood in Orthodox religion from where the concept comes. Becoming a saint is the hardest thing any human being can ever do. It does require work and great effort. It's not just a matter of believing in Jesus. But GunnerQ says that the only difference between sinner and saint is repentance, and that is just wrong. Repentance is merely the beginning of the road to sainthood, and it's a long hard road. There is quite a bit more, and I don't want to go through it all, but I would like to correct misunderstanding, some of which I acknowledge is my fault because the article is quite old and the ideas are expressed in language that comes more from esoteric terminology than I would normally use now. A major point is that GunnerQ seems to think that I am saying the masters come from the astral plane, whereas I am saying precisely the opposite. What is called the astral plane is the plane of illusion, and is where the demons operate. Then he decides that I am claiming that I am a wise, immortal master spirit who has transcended mortal limitations to achieve oneness with God himself. Not sure where he got that from, but may I reassure him that nothing is further from the truth. Like him, I am a human sinner struggling to make his way in life and be faithful to God. He concludes Mr. Wildblood needs to accept that demons got to him in his youth, and consequently, he filled his head with esoteric garbage for many years. He'll never overcome his human nature, let alone achieve perfection, on his own efforts. Any spirit that says otherwise is a demon wanting company in hell. Any human who says otherwise has rejected the only spiritual Superman that he'll ever encounter. I cannot overcome my fallen human nature on my own. I need Christ to enable me to do that. However, Christ needs my help too. I have to fight the falseness within me on a daily basis. I cannot just say I believe in Jesus and leave it at that. I have to fight the evil in my heart and cultivate the good, and it's a constant battle. I am sure GunnerQ would agree. Finally, I would say by their fruit set. The spirits, for want of a better word, who spoke to me were pure and good and holy, full of wisdom and love. For GunnerQ to assume they were demons is rather presumptuous, but I know he only does it to protect the truth as he sees it, and that's reasonable enough. I didn't accept them indiscriminately, but to have rejected them out of fear or suspicion would have been quite wrong, and increased experience only confirmed their authenticity as far as I am concerned. I am greatly indebted to them for their spiritual advice and for pointing out the flaws in my character I needed to work on. That's all they did, though always lovingly, albeit sometimes sternly too. In the context of the relationship I was a novice, and they acted like a kind of father superior. However, let me reassure readers of this blog that if obliged to choose between them and Jesus, I would choose Jesus every time, but then I believe they were and are working under the overall leadership of Christ. A monk in monastery obeys his abbot but sees the abbot as representing Christ. That was my position. Anyhow, I am grateful to GunnerQ for giving me the opportunity to clear up any misunderstanding. I don't think he and I are as far apart as it might seem. As with everything, When it comes to Christian blogs, motivation is key. Berger. I used to spend a great deal of time contemplating the ideas and opinions Christian blogs offer. I still do, but only after I have satisfactorily discerned the overarching motivation driving the blog and the blogger. At its most basic level, motivation provides the impetus for thinking, acting, and behaving in a certain way. Motivation also provides penetrating clues into a blogger's overall goals and objectives. The motivation driving a blog, not the ideas or opinions the blogger presents, reveals what the blogger truly is, where his priorities lie, and what he is ultimately aiming for. Motivation is particularly crucial in Christian blogs. Christian bloggers whose ideas, opinions, beliefs, and assumptions differ from mine do not unsettle me to any great extent, but Christian bloggers whose motivations do not seem to emanate from a good place appall me. Even more dismaying are Christian bloggers whose motivations inevitably point to the eclipsing of or absence of a good heart. As with everything, motivation wavers. Even the best Christian bloggers are susceptible to publishing posts that qualify as motivationally suspect. Such inconsistency is understandable and forgivable as long as the overarching motivation flowing from an otherwise structurally good heart remains. That said, when bloggers start losing their motivational grip, the motivational inconsistencies have a way of morphing into antithetical motivations. The good heart begins to fade, something else stands in its place, and the ideas and opinions the blogger shares stop meaning all that much, regardless of how penetrating or insightful the ideas and opinions happen to be. Note, a good heart is not synonymous with nice. Most nice Christian bloggers are insufferable, seemingly unsalvageable fools. Many nasty, cantankerous Christian bloggers have good hearts and clearly discernible motivations that are good, but that good heart and those good motivations must be discernible, otherwise, such bloggers are, at best, only nasty and cantankerous or, at worst, on the wrong side. Negative critique is worthless, unless it comes from a position of self-awareness concerning assumptions and motivations. Charlton. I think we are all prone to critique, ridicule and dismiss the ideas of others by arguing purely negatively and without being clear of the assumptions from which we are arguing. I've often done this myself, and indeed tend to fall into it as a kind of journalistic default, to the point that I try to catch and halt this tendency, before it gets too established. Of course, one cannot always, for example in every blog post, be restating one's assumptions. On the other hand, 1. It is obvious that most people do not even know what are their own assumptions, and 2. Even fewer people have subjected their own assumptions to the kind of critique that they so lavishly bestow upon other people. And 3. Even fewer people, having become aware of their own assumptions, and examined them critically, have found these assumptions to be solid to their own honest satisfaction over a prolonged self-critique. This is exactly why there is so much attacking of other people and their views in the modern world, including on the internet, and so little clarification of where that attack is coming from. When one's own views are unknown, incoherent, or feeble, and also if one's own person is very obviously flawed, then it makes sense to do everything possible to keep negative attention on the other chap and what the other chap is saying. But this is dishonest and incoherent. Therefore, unworthy of respect. This is, indeed, the entirety of the philosophical defense of modern mainstream ideology, the ideology shared by all people and institutions of wealth and power, all major participants in public discourse to the point that it does not even have a name for itself. I call it variously atheism, materialism, leftism, totalitarianism. But it itself does not acknowledge any of these names, nor any other term, for what is by far the most pervasive and enforced ideology in human history. So, I regard negative critique as so much blah blah, unless it is rooted in some, more or less explicitly known and acknowledged assumptions and motivations, some kind of evident self-awareness. This applies to critique emanating from what might be termed a traditionalist Christian perspective, which can be almost any denomination or church, and indeed, almost the same negative critique may emanate from people/institutions with very different assumptions, but this is not a strength. After all, we get essentially the same progressive negative critique of Christianity, coming in from multinational organizations such as the UN, from all Western nations, and all the multinational corporations and social institutions and the mass media, the establishment. Negative critique is, mostly, merely negatively motivated and ignorant of self, and even when it comes from multiple directions, it remains worthless. To be worth considering, negative critique must be in self-awareness of a coherent alternative and positive understanding. Recalling that a double negative is not a positive. In short, we ought to demand, of ourselves, as well as others, if not, then what? Value inversions also serve to reflect metaphysical assumptions, or, why virtually no Western church believes in God anymore. Francis Berger. Though they appeared around a century ago, I have found Max Scheler's hierarchy of values, metaphysical confusion, and value inversion concepts extremely helpful in clarifying why value inversions like altruism have superseded authentic Christian values. A four-tier hierarchy ranking values from highest to lowest provides the core of Scheler's work on the subject. The hierarchy, edited slightly, is as follows. 1. Values of the holy, the divine, creation, reality. 2. Spiritual, psychic, and mental values, truth, beauty, goodness, morality, ethics. 3. Sensual values, health, vitality, pleasure, the agreeable and disagreeable. 4. Values of utility, economics, government, politics. Scheler believed the values above to be a priori. I agree to an extent, but I would add that a certain set of metaphysical assumptions formed the values above, and such assumptions must be individually discovered and accepted as true before the values can be formed. Otherwise, one is simply adopting a set of values and the metaphysical assumptions upon which they are based. For example, Scheler was a devout Roman Catholic when he came up with the hierarchy of values, but later in his life, he abandoned Catholic metaphysical assumptions altogether, including belief in an omnipotent creator God in favor of pantheism. Needless to say, this shift in assumptions had a profound effect on his previously held values. I resist delving into Scheler's finer points concerning the hierarchy because I am using it here as an illustrative framework rather than an authoritative model, but I will go over the basics. None of the values in Scheler's hierarchy exist in isolation. Instead, they work together and influence each other according to their ranking. Thus, the values of the holy represent the peak that should guide and inform all other values, in descending order. Likewise, the values of utility at the bottom must accommodate the sensual values and the spiritual values, but like all other values, must be inspired by the values of the holy. The positive values above, ordered in the way they are, ultimately reflect a distinct set of metaphysical assumptions. Since the divine takes precedence over and guides all other values, the values of the holy provide the basis for all spiritual, psychic, and mental values, including things like philosophy, education, and art. These spiritual values then cascade down and govern the sensual values, which include defining the significance of pleasure, health, security, and safety. Finally, all spiritual and sensual values, inspired above all by the values of the holy, would culminate in the values of utility in things like the ordering and governing of society. According to Scheler, The hierarchy of values remains positive if it retains the ranking noted above and stays on the positive side of the value range, i.e., the worship of the divine rather than idols, art that aimed for beauty rather than ugliness, philosophy that was motivated to seek truth rather than prove falsehoods, and so forth. However, any shift in the range from positive to negative would eventually trigger tier displacement or rearrangement, thereby shifting some or all the values into the realm of negative values, leading to what Sheila refers to as metaphysical confusion. Metaphysical confusion causes value inversion, first as a shift from positive to negative, and then from lower to higher. For example, if the negative value of fearing disease usurps the positive value of maintaining healthfulness within the sensual values, the usurpation immediately impacts ethical and moral considerations at the level of spiritual values. If other sensual values follow suit, shift from positive to negative, then the tier of sensual values could move upward on the hierarchy and knock spiritual values down a level. Sheila argues that such movements indicate metaphysical confusion. Instead of the spiritual informing the sensual now informs the spiritual. And since spiritual values have fallen in ranking, the first order of business for the values of the holy would be to attend to the values of the senses and vice versa. The values of utility might then tackle the negative values directly via governmental dictates aimed at fighting disease via bureaucratic control. Such a shift would then relegate spiritual values to the bottom of the hierarchy, where they would be informed rather than serving to inform. And so on. Sheila's used the term value delusion to refer to these negative shifts in the hierarchy and noted that such delusions immediately entailed metaphysical confusion, leading to value inversion. Why am I bringing all of this up? To draw attention to values and demonstrate how these reflect metaphysical assumptions. The point I want to argue here is that values do not create metaphysical assumptions create values. To illustrate, I offer the following tacked together hierarchy of inverted values as representative of our current time and place, once again, ranked from higher to lower. 1. Values of utility, totalitarian control via the science, experts, and media, dishonest politics, exploitative voodoo economics, climate change hysteria, anti-racism, mass migration, vilification of native populations in the West, self-destructive altruism, the birdemic and the peck, etc. 2. Sensual values, the homo and trans agendas, hedonism, feminism, plague fear, no one is safe until everyone is safe, etc. 3. Spiritual values, corrupt churches and institutions, right is wrong, vulgar non-art or anti-art, falsehoods as philosophy, corrupted education, media and social media, materialism, mindfulness, etc. 4. Values of the holy, hypocrisy, a concept of the divine modeled upon the values of utility, like it or not. The hierarchy of inverted values above is probably an accurate representation of how our contemporary world orders and ranks its values. Moreover, this hierarchy of value inversion reflects a distinct set of metaphysical assumptions our modern world holds concerning the ultimate nature of reality. To demonstrate how these metaphysical assumptions manifest in the world, I will turn to Dr. Charlton, who described the Church of England's actions during the birdemic in the following way. In April of 2020 during the birdemic lockdowns, the Church of England's churches were allowed, by the bishop's instructions, to open and be used for use as food banks and PEC centres, while all sacramental activity in the same buildings was forbidden. Analogous actions were taken by all major Christian churches, revealing their true priorities were almost exclusively material, expedient, and totalitarian compatible. Let's break that down according to the slapdash value inversion hierarchy I put together above. 1. At the behest of the secular government and its globalist rulers, which occupy the peak of the hierarchy, the Church of England, which now officially sits near the bottom of the hierarchy of inverted values, closed its doors and offered no religious services. This action demonstrates that the values of utility guide and inform all other values, including the values of the holy. 2. The Church of England closed its doors because it bowed not only to values of utility but also to sensual values. Keeping everyone safe physically was infinitely more important than providing religious services or communing with the divine. 3. When the Church of England finally did open its doors, it used its buildings and churches as food banks and pec centers rather than for religious reasons, proving that it was adhering to the modern spiritual values of placing the material over the spiritual, health over soul, physical nourishment over spiritual nourishment, etc. 4. The above shows that the Church of England believes in a God that endorses the values of utility above all else. Put another way, the Church of God believes in a God who does not believe in himself. Reread the value chain I have sketched above and ask yourself this: what metaphysical assumptions do the Church of England hold? What do the people who lead the Church of England believe about the fundamental nature of reality? How do these assumptions motivate them? How do they create and inform their values? The Church of England is certainly not alone in this. Virtually every church, government, institution, organization, and association in the West loyally adheres to this hierarchy of value inversions and gross metaphysical confusion, as do most individuals comprising Western societies, implying that the West is currently under the sway of a particularly abhorrent set of metaphysical assumptions. Metaphysical assumptions matter. Values matter. That is why sorting out assumptions and values is the most meaningful and vital task individual Christians can take on in this time and place. Taking personal responsibility for those assumptions and their subsequent values must follow. I would even dare to say that this falls into the category of non-negotiable. As Dr. Charlton notes in the linked post above, the only way out and forward from burial beneath the vast complex of wrong motivations and false priorities and confused intentions that led to such appalling practices, in so many churches, is a clean break. Only from a ground zero position of complete spiritual freedom from the currently suffocating network of worldly entanglements and social responsibilities, can properly Christian motivations be rediscovered and renewed. Only after we have solidly established the priority of the spiritual, may we then choose to rebuild a selective and effective concern with the material. We live in the age of accusation, says commenter Epimetheus. Bruce Charlton. An astute observation from Epimetheus deserves our further consideration.
I've taken to thinking about our time as being the age of accusation, to reference Satan as being a constant, relentless accuser, someone who loves nothing more than to bury you under the shame and guilt of the sins that Jesus would forgive. At this point, the main cultural product of the West is talking about other people's sins. There's almost nothing else being said, just infinite guilt tripping and shaming and constant accusations. It's bizarre once you see it.
Note, extracted from the comments of yesterday's post. This is true, and, I would say, more deeply true here and now than elsewhere and in the past, because our godless and despiritualized civilization has no basis for purpose and motivation, hence we as individuals and members of institutions have no coherent positive values. To prevent our lack of coherent positive values from being noticed by ourselves and by others, our culture engages in a continuously sustained frenzy of accusatory thought, speech, and action. Underneath the accusation there is nothing, nihil. Our attention and energies are utterly consumed by mutual accusation. Our inner nihilism is projected outwards to accuse everything around us. This is, indeed, the age of accusation. A comment for GunnerQ on esotericism. Bruce Charlton. I cannot induce GunnerQ's Substack blog to accept an extended comment on his recent posting, so I shall reproduce it here. You seem to be working something out at present, using over-inclusive and scattergun principles and arguments that, I predict, you will discover fail to discriminate between what you value/want to preserve and what you, rightly, abhor and wish to exclude. Thus, I think you are painting yourself into a corner, as you will realize sooner or later. And I am confident you will realize this, since you are clearly honest and well motivated. Nonetheless, speaking from experience, this painting oneself into a corner is sometimes the best way to learn deeply, that is. I painted myself into a very terrible corner in the early 2000s, e.g. in my book The Modernization Imperative, but it was, apparently, necessary for me to plumb materialism to the very dregs before I could recognize its innate nihilism, and could choose to become a Christian. More generally, that has been the usual way for me to learn, throw everything in, trying to make something work, and only when it has collapsed, that is, from my POV, will I abandon it. Anyway, I certainly agree that there is a kind of black magic cult near the top level of totalitarian control in the world, mostly Western world. This is very important to recognize. I've written about this variously. But you notice that these insights came from Rudolf Steiner, who himself had an esoteric, albeit not secret, society, and, one with not a few undesirable aspects. Plus, 90-something% of what Steiner wrote is, so far as I can tell from the large but minority sample of his writings I have read, completely, and sometimes perversely, wrong. My point is that there is, I have found, and continue to find, a good deal to be gained from reading Steiner and other occultists who are on the Christian side, the side of good, Dion Fortune, Gareth Knight, while avoiding, completely, or almost so, those on the dark side, the left-hand path. Indeed, these are some of only a handful of authors I would regard as personal mentors, to a greater, Steiner, or lesser, DF and GK, extent. Reading, as always, must be with discernment, because, speaking personally, there is nobody, not one single individual, in the whole world, past or present, whose core views I accept in toto, and typically I reject, later, if not sooner, most of what anybody writes. In conclusion, occultism and esoteric organization is a method, not a goal, a means not an end, and well-motivated and real Christians may, or may not, choose to engage with esoteric/occult material and methods according to preference. As always, motivation is primary, and discernment is necessary, because discernment is just another name for taking the fullest possible personal responsibility for our spiritual life. Esoteric/occult activity is neither more, nor less, dangerous than the far more pervasive and equally deadly literalism/Phariseeism, and institution worship/obedience, to which too many traditionalist Christians are not just prone but explicitly dedicated. Not even the fourth gospel, that greatest of all Christian texts. Greatest of all texts, do I accept in its entirety, because I'm sure there are errors and later alien additions, even in the divinely inspired King James's translation. A dangerous time to be a woman. William Wildblood. From the spiritual point of view, this is a dangerous time to be a woman. That might seem an odd thing to say since women have more power and freedom today than ever before, but that is just the point. There is more power and freedom to reject God and the order of creation, and there is political and cultural support for doing so. A woman in the modern world must have a finely tuned spiritual sensibility to go against the prevailing winds. Plus an awareness of her natural tendencies towards vanity and entitlement. That doesn't mean reversion to traditional behavior, because there was always some truth and necessity in the idea of female emancipation and empowerment in the 19th century. To deny that would be to deny reality. All human beings were moving towards a greater awareness of self. Nonetheless, the truth that prompted the original ideas behind feminism do not justify its capitulation to forces of egotism, resentment, spiritual greed, pride and ignorance, which is what has happened. It should be obvious to an unbiased mind that contemporary trends in feminist ideology have led to the validation of female pathologies and the rebranding as positive virtues of such things as hatred of men, excessive self-assertion, extreme emotionalism, aggressive argumentativeness, narcissism, I'm worth it, and other familiar examples of what can reasonably be described as toxic femininity. The traditional and true feminine virtues such as kindness, humility, gentleness, ability to sacrifice, all summed up in the figure of the Blessed Virgin Mary, are derided as weak and submissive, concocted as ideals by men to keep women in check. At the same time, women are led into areas of life in which they have to suppress their natural femininity and develop more masculine traits which just separate them from their true selves and paths of spiritual fulfillment. You get what an acquaintance of mine once called the female cockerel. And yet, it has to be said, properly oriented women would not succumb to this. Those who do succumb do so because they are indulging an aspect of their fallen nature. A test has been given them and they have not proved equal to the temptations of egotism. I know someone who has strong elements of what we now call borderline and narcissistic personality disorders and who, unsurprisingly, is a radical feminist because her radical feminism justifies and validates her psychological disorders. This may be thought an extreme example, but I wonder how many other times this scenario plays out in the minds of modern Western women who have been given the opportunity to sin in a way that has not been open to them before. I am reminded of Jesus' saying that it is harder for the rich to get into heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Riches is not just about money. It is also about power. Women have more of both these days and are correspondingly more at risk of spiritual loss. This may not only be the fault of women, though it must be said that it is mostly their fault because of female egotism, and let's not pretend otherwise in the name of a misconceived sense of chivalry. Nevertheless, men have been weak and abandoned their natural responsibilities and duties. They have fallen for the temptation of wanting to be thought fair and progressive. So, in effect, both sexes have repeated the sin of the Garden of Eden, and the spiritual consequences are similar with increased separation from God the most significant. I suspect that the degree to which a woman is or is not a feminist in the 21st century sense indicates the degree to which she is or is not in tune with the Spirit of Christ. It's not the only measure, but it is an important one. This doesn't mean that the ways of the past did not need to evolve. The development of consciousness means that the roles of the sexes did need to change at about the time they began to do so, but framing the discourse in terms of equality was a grave error. It should have required each sex seeking out its spiritual archetype and then conforming the soul to that. Women were meant to manifest greater personal autonomy, but they were not meant to imitate men, still less seek to usurp their roles, which increasingly they have, and one of the consequences of that is the feminization of institutions. The feminization of any institution always leads to its ineffectiveness, as it first weakens and then eventually destroys the mission of that institution. This can be seen most obviously today in the fields of the university and the media. But it is also happening in science and religion, which are both much diminished in our time as feelings replace facts and consensus trumps truth, with hierarchical distinction broken down to egalitarian mediocrity. The accusation of misogyny is often used to disarm and paint black those who simply point out the disorders of females while doing the same thing for men is fine. Those who uphold the traditional Christian, or just traditional, view of the roles of the two sexes are similarly dismissed. It's yet another weaponized word, racism, sexism, etc., which is trotted out to shut down argument and score points without being required to demonstrate truth. All radical political movements seek to capture and control language, and it is important in any fight back not to be bound by or respect the linguistic conventions of the new ideology, which only exist to force the argument into certain predetermined channels. It's also important not to fall for softer versions of the ideology, which is a temptation, as one might think these are not so bad as what else is on offer. I have noticed several books published recently by people describing themselves as ex-feminists or rational feminists who don't hate men, and wish to reclaim the territory that has been captured by the extreme version. One might feel relieved that sanity is reasserting itself, but when you investigate these you find it is the same thing as before, just presented slightly differently. Often it is the sexual revolution that is rejected, but that is only because it has advantaged men and disadvantaged women, which may be true, but it is a different question to that of the fundamentally misconceived basis of feminism itself. Feminism can be regarded as a test for women. For both sexes, but mostly for women. It is one that the great majority of them are failing. It is rather like giving someone a lot of money or power and seeing what they do with it, how they react to it. That is why I say this is a spiritually dangerous time to be a woman. You have been given what you want or what your ego wants. Of course, the other side of this is that those women who see through this worldly temptation will make considerable spiritual progress. As for men, they have to reject the spiritual sin of feminism while acknowledging that men and women both represent a fundamental aspect of God's creation, though their roles are not the same, should not be confused, though there is overlap, and must be understood if harmony is to reign. The wise and the foolish understand this. The merely clever, of whom there are many these days, do not. Modern education has a lot to answer for. The tragedy of the external in Ferenc Molnár's The Paul Street Boys. Francis Berger. The Paul Street Boys sculpture in Budapest. This brief post on Ferenc Molnár's classic youth novel The Paul Street Boys contains every spoiler imaginable. I have been reading books in Hungarian over the past 3 years to keep my Magyar language skills up. Though I am fluent in the language, have lived in the country for nearly a decade, and easily pass as a native, I don't use the language much because I essentially live in a bubble world here in Hungary. Off the bat, I have to say that my experience with Hungarian literature thus far has been a little disappointing. Hungarians take pride in their literary culture and often name streets and squares after their authors and poets. However, the little Hungarian literature I have read has been rather dull and mediocre, or overladen with politics or artifice. Even the supposed masterpieces I have read to date have been mostly meh. Great works of Hungarian literature undoubtedly exist, I guess I just haven't been lucky enough to pick one up yet. On that note, I am pleased to report that Ferenc Molnár's classic youth novel The Paul Street Boys, which I finished yesterday, has bucked the disappointing Magyar literature trend. Though not a masterpiece, the novel is a solid example of excellence in its genre. First published in 1906, The Paul Street Boys remains a staple in grade school curriculums here in Hungary and ranks among the most read Hungarian novels beyond Hungary's borders. I tend to write meandering and overlong book summaries, so I'll let Wikipedia provide a brief overview of The Paul Street Boys.
The novel is about schoolboys in the Jos Város neighborhood of Budapest and is set in 1889. The Paul Street Boys spend their free time at the Grund, an empty lot that they regard as their fatherland. The story has two main protagonists, János Boka, the honorable leader of the Paul Street Boys, and Erno Nemecek, the smallest member of the group. When the Redshirts, another gang of boys, led by Ferenc, who gather at the nearby botanical gardens, attempt to take over the Grund, the Paul Street Boys are forced to defend themselves in military fashion. Although the Paul Street Boys win the war, and little Nemecek repeatedly demonstrates that his bravery and loyalty surpass his size, the book ends in tragedy. Nemecek dies of the pneumonia he caught in the conflict. At the very end of the book, Boka also learns that a tenement building will soon be erected on the Grund lot, meaning that the boy's heroic struggle to defend it and Nemechek's sacrifice was in vain.
The novel's ending addresses the inherent insufficiency of mortal life in this world of continual change and entropy, which is quite a way to end a youth novel. Eventually, the external world will abandon us. We will inevitably lose everything we work and struggle for. All that we defend will one day be taken from us. The people we love will all die just as we will die. Our little pieces of heaven on earth will disappear and become something else. The final sentence of the novel captures this quite subtly yet brilliantly, my translation from the original.
Boka Janos Komolian Nezet Maga Ella Pudra, S. Mostaloser Kesdet di Rengini Ijaseru Gyarikolk Benasates Errol, Hoj Tulahdan Kepen Mi Azaz Alit, Amalanik Mein Nyajan Kuzdo, Hol Banatos, Hol Vidam Solgai Vagyunk. Janos Boka looked earnestly at the bench in front of him, and for the first time, his simple child soul experienced a sense of what life is and what we, as its servants, struggle against, sometimes sadly, sometimes happily.
Ferenc Molnár ends the Paul Street Boys there. He makes no mention of the choices available to Boka after the boy experiences that sense of what life is, but I hope one of the choices would lead Boka to the eventual realization that he's not merely life's servant and that what life is not all life is. Yet, hoping Boka will find Christ is not enough. Boka must find the internal Christ, because if his faith finds Christ only in the external world, he will eventually lose Christ, too, one day. Second-hand Christians and spiritual scaremongering. Bruce Charlton. For a couple of years back in 2010-11, I was deeply immersed in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as can be seen from this blog, at that time, and I was especially interested by that tradition's embrace of mysticism and spiritual experience, how this worked and how they dealt with the problems. The US lay monk Seraphim Rose, later a priest-monk, wrote on this topic with what seemed like great insight and a full acknowledgement of modern conditions. What I derived from this was that the ascetic monks and hermits of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, including the millennium before the Great Schism division of the Catholic Church, which was caused by divergence of the Western Latin tradition, especially the emerging influence of philosophical theology, were indeed actively seeking a direct and personal relationship with the divine and with spiritual beings, with God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, Mary the Mother of God, angels, and saints, dead and living. This active seeking of mystical spiritual experience was pursued by very extreme measures, including extreme asceticism, lack of food, extremes of heat or cold, immobility, and heroic vigils, staying awake praying for many hours, sometimes in adverse conditions, and by prolonged meditation including solitude for extended periods, sometimes years. The Eastern Orthodox tradition is, however, very aware of the problem of achieving spiritual experiences that are demonic rather than with representatives of God. This is often represented as demonic attack, or sometimes of succumbing to temptations such as spiritual pride, or being deceived. Some of the greatest of saints are represented as susceptible. For example, it seems that England's greatest saint, Cuthbert, was assailed, i.e. badly tempted, by demons when he went into solitude on the island of Inverfarne, off the coast of Northumberland. Seraphim Rose also explained that there was no valid method or system by which angels and demons could be distinguished reliably, because demons were capable of impersonating angels convincingly, and because the mystic's own evaluations were affected by his own, inevitable, because human, sinful impulses. According to Seraphim Rose, over many centuries, the best method for protecting mystics from demonic temptations was a spiritual father who had himself known and overcome such temptations, and who might reasonably be assumed to be wholly dedicated to the spiritual good of his spiritual sons and daughters. There was, especially, and in the end, only, in Russia an unbroken lineage of spiritual fathers in the premier monasteries, that ensured the overall and across-time integrity of the Russian Orthodox tradition. But this lineage was broken, permanently, with the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the subsequent murder of the Tsar and his family, and, essentially, all of the true-hearted bishops, abbots and holy monks, except those who escaped overseas and were dispersed in non-orthodox nations, and they left no heirs of their stature. What I got from this was that direct mystical spiritual contact was essential to Eastern Orthodoxy over many, many centuries, therefore it was worth taking the risks of being deceived by demons, even though there was no really reliable method of ensuring that some aspirants were not deceived. There could be, and was, pre-selection of those monks who were best motivated, before they were allowed to become extreme ascetics, or hermits. But this was no guarantee, since all men are sinful, hence susceptible, to some extent. And even the best supervision by holy fathers did not reach into the desert conditions of the hermits, which may last for years. For example, there was nobody to supervise Saint Cuthbert in the harsh solitude of Inner Farm. But the background to all this implicitly seems to have been that personal contact between men and spiritual beings, and God, was so vital that risks must be taken. Eastern Orthodoxy works in a society in which there is a communal spirituality, such that individuals are immersed in the group mind of the people, such that the Tsar really can represent his people in relation to God, and monks really can be intermediaries between the divine and the mass of lay people. But modern Western consciousness excludes this possibility, and therefore we are confronted by a choice between, on the one hand, personally taking the same kind of risks that the Eastern Orthodox monks used to take, but without the possibility of valid human supervision, because the churches are all net corrupted, and men of the spiritual stature of past holy fathers are not to be found. Seraphim Rose was very definite about that. And, on the other hand, practicing a second-hand faith. Practicing, that is, a Christianity that has lost its beating heart of contact with the divine, angels, and good spirits of other kinds, a Christianity of mere scholarship. A Christian faith that is about being a Christian, got from books and other people, following rules and rituals, doing set tasks, and expressing certain formulae of words, rather than actually being a Christian. That mainstream modern Christianity is merely second-hand and not a real faith, and therefore weak and eagerly, corruptible, was made obvious in 2020, if it was not already so. The problem is that being a second-hand Christian is another way of not being a Christian. That is why a second-hand Christianity that engages in spiritual scaremongering, and eschews or prescribes direct and personal spiritual contacts with God, Jesus Christ and the wide range of divine and good spiritual beings, is a weak, fake Christianity, because it is spiritually dead. Therefore, the only way actually to be a Christian is to take the risks of being deceived. And to have faith that anyone who is genuinely motivated to God and Jesus Christ will be able to receive the necessary divine corrections, when things go wrong. When, not if, things go wrong. Now that traditions of spiritual discipleship are broken, and now that men have no good churches upon which faith can be pinned, and when our consciousness has become individual and agentic, rather than being immersed in a group, so that Christians must take personal responsibility. We can be sure -100% confident, that God our Heavenly Father and the Creator, has ensured that every single person is, nonetheless, able to get the experiences and guidance he needs for attaining salvation and spiritual development. If individual spiritual knowledge and mystical experience are indeed a necessary part of being a Christian, as was believed by the Eastern Orthodox for nearly 2,000 years, then we can be sure and confident that this has been made possible. Possible for me, and for you. So, if you do not already know this by experience, then it is time you found out, that is, if you desire to be and remain Christian. To summarize, there is no safe way to be a Christian, therefore the danger of spiritual scaremongering is considerable, and safety-firstism must be rejected, since the sanction for yielding to spiritual scaremongering is to become first a second-hand Christian, then, because that is so feeble and easily corruptible, not at all. One who rejects personal discernment and responsibility and seeks safety in external institutions and rules, will simply not be a Christian before very long, will be led by the nose away from Jesus Christ. Remember, this is, here and now, a world where all major institutions, national and global, including the churches, are under overall demonic control. Demons want all religion to be mediated by human institutions, because demons can control institutions. Surely that is obvious. Thus, all Christians need direct spiritual contact with, and guidance from, the divine and all possible beings of good, and must therefore take courage, take the risks, in a spirit of trial and error, while being always open to correction by divine feedback, which will be made available, and ready for repentance. Note added, I suppose I should say again what I have already stated so many times, which is that I think the current situation is that many, most, all real Christians have actually already started doing exactly what I recommend, have used personal discernment and taken personal responsibility for their Christian faith, including their choice of denomination and church, and which authorities to follow in that particular church. But, because this has been unconscious, hidden from their own awareness, they have not acknowledged explicitly to themselves that this is what they have actually done, and instead they pretend/assert that their choices were actually compelled by evidence, reason, logic or some such external and supposedly objective source, for which they, personally, eschew responsibility for choosing, claiming necessity. These are living in a situation of bad faith by denial of what is true. Since such a situation is fundamentally incoherent, therefore their Christianity is weak, and readily corrupted or diverted. I suspect that something of this kind is responsible for the incremental loss of once real Christians, year by year, as they fail one or another litmus test, become this worldly in their primary orientation and aspirations, or fall into an externally controlled form of second-hand Christianity that presages de facto exit from the faith. We are St. Nicholas Day. Francis Berger. My village has this Advent tradition in which 24 households divvy up the 24 days leading up to Christmas. Each participating household takes one of the days and decorates a street-facing window for that day. A newly decorated window with the number marking the day appears each evening during the weeks leading up to Christmas. As part of the tradition, villagers go out for a stroll each evening to find and appreciate the window decoration marking that day. Once villagers find the household featuring the decorated window offers its visiting neighbors pastries and tea or mulled wine and, perhaps, some good, stiff palinka, fruit schnapps, for the men. My family is taking part in the tradition for the first time this year, as window decorators, and we have been assigned December 6th, St. Nicholas Day. We spent some time brainstorming ideas yesterday before finally deciding upon a traditional-looking St. Nicholas with staff in hand, a basket laden with gifts on his back, walking through the snow toward a small village. We drew what we needed and spent the evening cutting out the white paper silhouette components and affixing them to the inside of my son's bedroom window, which happens to be the middle window facing the street, and then illuminated the scene from the interior windowsill. It's nothing fancy, but I think it turned out quite well. I promised to post a photo of it after the big reveal on December 6th. However, what I really want to share in this post is the immense fun I had creating the window decoration. The second I began working on it, I was transported back to my childhood when I considered little projects like this a very big deal. I revisited the joy and elation at creating something for a special occasion, and as I fashioned out the figures for the window, I experienced the same childlike zeal and enthusiasm I used to when I engaged in similar activities as a boy. Though the task itself was delightful, how the simple activity moved my spirit extended beyond that into something almost magical. I'm not sure how to describe the sensation. All I can say is that it transcended nostalgia, and touched a deep-rooted but sadly neglected aspect of my innate creativity and joie de vivre. I'm going to insist we participate in the Advent window decoration tradition every year from now on. I'm also going to focus on ways of accessing that neglected creativity and joie de vivre more often. Devonshire and original participation. Bruce Charlton. Owen Barfield's conceptualization of original participation is the putative consciousness, way of being in the world of both ancient men, nomadic hunter-gatherers, and of all men during early childhood. So, in principle, we should all be able to remember, to some extent, what it is like to live in original participation with the world, that is, to be an animistic consciousness that includes dreaming as well as waking, immersed in and aware of the family circle, and much else, house, garden, trees, animals, pictures, television and radio. All experienced as essentially alive and aware and in communication. My own memories of this state seem to be particularly clear, compared with what other people tell me of their own memories, and this may be a consequence of the fact that my family relocated from Devonshire to Somerset just about the time I began school aged 5. Just at the time when my consciousness began to develop out from original participation, and began the gradual transition of late childhood towards the consciousness soul at adolescence, and, in our society, continuing until death in most people. Therefore, my memories of Devon are through the lens of original participation, and as such rather clearly differentiated and cut off from the later and more self-conscious and active, but alienated, detached, way of relating to the world that began sharply, with leaving the home environment, attending a school for many hours a day, and moving to Somerset. In the beginning was the Word, but the Word does not mean Jesus, plus note added. Bruce Charlton.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not.
Since this beautiful passage from chapter 1 at the beginning of John's Gospel, especially in the Authorized Version translation, is a part of nearly every Christmas carol service I have ever attended, it seems like an opportunity to remind anyone interested of my alternative understanding of what this great poetry really means. Derived from my belief in the primacy of the fourth Gospel. And to re-emphasize that the word does not refer to Jesus, as so many have claimed. Note added, 5th of December 2023. I had always loved this passage at the beginning of John, from long before I became a Christian in my late 40s. I got a fair bit of Christian teaching as a child, because I was educated at a rural Church of England school aged 5 to 11, the local rector was chairman of governors, and we would quite often attend services, the church was just a few yards away. I began to become very interested in Christianity from my middle 20s, reading many books of theology and apologetics, both Protestant and Roman Catholic. I even subscribed to the UK Dominican Friars Black Friars magazine for a year in my late 20s. What I never encountered was detailed, line by line and word by word biblical exegesis. Anyway, my point is that, despite such a lot of Christian exposure, and multiple readings and listenings to John's early verses, and indeed the whole Gospel, it never crossed my mind that the word was supposed to mean Jesus. When I came across this idea, in a Protestant, evangelical, context, I was flabbergasted. For a while I passively accepted that this must be true, because so many textual expositors were saying it, but I never felt comfortable with the equation, my conscience pricked, it always seemed forced and bogus. I was pleased eventually to arrive at an explanation that fitted with the rest of the Gospel. The key is the poetic parallelism, which I, somehow, hadn't noticed, probably due to viewing the passage through spectacles that insisted it was dogmatic metaphysical philosophy, to be taken literally. For instance, when I read the word was with God, and the Word was God. I assumed that this slight difference in wording must mean we were being taught a subtle and vital theological distinction, rather than its being a poetic form. So, what exactly the word/logos means in this passage, is not possible to make explicit since human consciousness, hence language, has changed, see Owen Barfield's Poetic Diction. Then words had multiple simultaneous references incorporating spiritual realities, but now our words are narrowly precise and objective, so that no number of our words can mean what a single word meant to the ancients. Now we can only talk around it with a paraphrase. But I think we can consider the word/logos to be God. But God with an emphasis on his creative nature, his attributes as the creator. My innocent yet naughty Krampusnacht / Saint Nicholas Day faux pas. Francis Berger. Saint Nicholas Day is a big deal in Hungary, at least for kids. On the evening before Saint Nicholas Day, children place their cleaned and polished shoes on a windowsill for the same reason children in other Western countries hang stockings on fireplaces on Christmas Eve, to have them filled with goodies. According to Central European law, Saint Nicholas visits every household on the evening of the 5th to fill good children's shoes with small gifts and treats. However, Saint Nicholas does not arrive alone that night. Accompanying him is the Krampus, a frightening, half-goat, half-demon monster whose sole mission boils down to punishing the bad children Saint Nicholas refuses to reward with treats. While good kids can expect goodies from Saint Nick, bad kids can only look forward to a sound-beating courtesy of the Krampus, who enthusiastically whips all the naughty children with a switch made of branches. Although December 6th is Saint Nicholas Day, the evening of the 5th is Krampusnacht, and heaven help any bad kid on Krampusnacht. Hence, on the morning of the 6th, good kids enjoy treats, the not-so-good nurse their injuries. The Krampus has since considerably toned down its violence. Instead of beating badly behaved children or eating them or taking them straight to hell, it merely leaves a small switch of twigs in the shoes, symbolizing that the kid should shape up before Christmas. When I lived in Hungary briefly about 20 years ago, my wife and I agreed to put our shoes out on separate windowsills with the understanding that we would secretly fill each other's shoes with goodies. I have to say, it was fun waking up to shoes full of treats on the 6th. My wife had filled one of my shoes with chocolate and sweets and had placed a Krampus switch of twigs in the other. Later that day, a corporate student playfully asked me if I had put my shoes out the night before and was quite surprised when I informed him that I had. I then took a moment to explain how my wife and I had secretly filled each other's shoes. He smiled and asked me if I had been good or naughty. I responded by saying that I had been both. Good and naughty? He asked. How is that possible? I described how my wife had filled one shoe with sweets and wanted to explain how she had placed a switch in the other, but instead of saying vergax, which is the Magyar word for a small switch of branches, I used the word korbux, the Hungarian word for, well, something that looks like this. My student looked at me with a sly, amused expression and said, "Good and naughty, eh? Okay, I think I get it now." Why is heaven necessary? Because evil accumulates. Because this world is based on vampirism, life feeds on life. Bruce Charlton. This is how I see it. Some people perceive no need for heaven. They either this life in this world suffices, or else they want to give back to God their entrance ticket to mortal life. They desire to cease to exist as separate souls, and to become reabsorbed into the divine, into the totality. But there are ineradicable problems with this life in this world, not matter how ideally things might be arranged, because this is a world where entropy, death, has the upper hand, and wins in the long run with respect to every being. Beings are eternal, and have agency, but in this mortal world, bodies and all physical manifestations are temporary. Therefore, over time, there are more and more once embodied, now disembodied, but eternal spirits, and some of these will have made the choice of evil. Yes, dead, discarnate beings can be replaced by more incarnate beings. Yes, additional creation can keep pace with disease, decline, aging, death. But the problem is that evil accumulates, and that is why the world keeps getting worse. By evil, I mean that which opposes God and divine creation, which has made that choice. The trouble is that in order to live, life feeds on life. And this applies to the spiritual as well as the physical. Vampirism is the rule of this world, for all those who are unwilling to accept oblivion, and there are always some of these, and, apparently, more and more. What happens is that there are spirits who maintain conscious and agentic, motivated, life by feeding off the life energies of other beings, and some of these are men. They spiritually vampirize other men in life, and, unless there is repentance, this continues after death, when they become spirits. So, these evil spirits of once incarnate men accumulate in this world, at least for so long as there are living men for them to feed upon. Some others are men who never incarnated, what we term demons. These also maintain their consciousness, energy, power, by consuming others. What this means is that while God can keep creating and adding new beings to this world, this also has the side effect of increasing the food supply of demons and evil men, alive and post-mortal, of the vampiric type. Thus evil accumulates in this world. I think this was understood by the ancient Christian and other prophets who foretold end time when evil would have the upper hand. The world was net evil, and where the longer things continued, the worse, more evil, overall, they would get. They foresaw that the only way out was that there must be a second creation, one that excluded death and entropy, a second creation of pure creation. And this is what Jesus Christ made for us with heaven, that heaven which we enter via death and resurrection. Because at resurrection we choose to leave behind all this is evil, all that opposes divine creation, and we become beings of pure creation, which is pure love. Thus heaven is necessary in the sense that otherwise the world will just keep getting worse and worse, the longer it continues. Spiritual scaremongering is covert materialism/positivism, a surrender to Ahrimanic totalitarianism. Bruce Charlton. The mainstream Orthodox Christian stance of extreme suspicion against anything spiritual, what I recently dubbed spiritual scaremongering, is a deadly error that leads indirectly but almost inevitably into embracing the Ahrimanic, bureaucratic totalitarianism of this world, but especially the West. This is because spiritual scaremongering is a species of materialism/positivism/scientism/reductionism, and that is what has delivered the whole world of global and, almost entirely, national social institutions and public discourse into the rulership of demonic evil. As modern men have become individual consciousnesses, alienated, cut off, but also more free, potentially spiritual agents, so that we are no longer unconsciously and spontaneously immersed in the consciousness of each other, so has dwindled to insignificance the ancient and medieval way that an exemplary Christian monarch, and Christian priests, monks and nuns of valid churches, could act for the community in spiritual matters. When in the past, and the further past, the more this is so, we all shared in each other's consciousness, one, or a small group, could indeed act for all a spiritual community. So that there was no necessity for all men to have spiritual contact with the divine or with spiritual beings, since the spiritual work of a small proportion of selected, trained, supervised persons could do this on behalf of the community, as with the medieval monastic ideal of intercession. No longer. We do not feel spontaneously and powerfully participators in, parts of, a spiritual community. All such immersive group phenomena have declined, catastrophically, and those who insist upon them, who insist upon obedience to an institution, including a church, those who will not deploy their own spiritual potential. Such persons are either left bereft, by their own choices, not by God, or else have de facto substituted the material for the spiritual. They have, in effect, delivered themselves up to society in a world where society is net evil and ruled by evil imperatives. Here and now, we cannot rely on other people, past or present, for the benefits of spiritual and divine contact, and if we try to do this, we will merely be second-hand Christians, which means, because of the corruption of social discourse and institutions, we will not be Christians. Spirit is primary, and contains all. The physical realm is indeed always and necessarily spiritual, but the physical is a subset of the spiritual realm. And the divine is a subset of the spiritual. We ought therefore, I believe, to consider spiritual contact, i.e. contact with the spiritual aspects of this world, as a necessary participation in the whole world. Lacking which we have self-excluded from participation in the whole world, and cut off the possibility of our own escape from the totalitarian evils of the system. Therefore, spiritual scaremongering is a covert form of materialism, a species of metaphysical self-blinding against the spiritual, hence the divine. As I said a few days ago, demons want all religion to be mediated by human institutions, because demons can, and currently do, control institutions. In sum, we must take the risks of seeking spiritual contact. We have no alternative if we wish to become and remain Christian in a world where the demons have taken over net control of social institutions, including the churches, and where this evil corruption is worsening. Because we now need to become Christians ourselves, first-hand, therefore rooted in spiritual contacts generally, and divine contacts in particular. Note added, the reason for the hardline urgency of this blog post, is that I seem to see far too many serious Orthodox and traditionalist Christians who are following their churches away from the warm-hearted, loving, personal nature, of the truth of following Jesus Christ. And instead descending into the hard-hearted, this worldly literalism/legalism/Phariseeism that modern church-based Christianity becomes when its adherents eschew personal responsibility for faith, and metaphysical choices. The trajectory leads away from the spirit and into a material world dominated, as never before, by the spirit of Satan. This trajectory is, I think, consequent upon the necessary goal of seeking courage to hold the line, but doing so by accusation and doubling down on obedience to a church as their primary, non-negotiable, virtue. Wealth, status and power. William Wildblood. These are the goods that most people want. Some want wealth more than power and some status more than wealth, but most people want these things to various degrees. And yet the spiritual path is all about turning around and walking in a different direction, and those who aspire to the mysteries of the kingdom of God must learn to renounce worldly gifts and possessions. They must largely do without wealth and status and power. Traditionally, the way to do this was to follow the path of poverty, chastity and obedience, which are more or less the contrary aspects of these things. This used to be well understood, but many people nowadays seem to believe they can have the worldly goods and still lead a proper spiritual life. They would justify this by saying it's fine to have these things as long as you aren't attached to them. Some would even say that worldly gifts are a sign of God's approval, which is patently absurd, but then there's nothing so outlandish that somebody somewhere won't believe it if it suits him. As for non-attachment, it's a nice theory, but generally if you have money, status and power, you either are or you become attached to them. Self-deception is easy. Real renunciation not so much. Jesus said no man can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. He also that it's harder for a rich man to get to heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Paul wrote to Timothy that the love of money is the root of all evil. These are very simple statements, but we still shy away from facing the reality. There's no virtue in being poor and no sin in being rich as such, but wealth is often or even usually a spiritually corrupting influence which fortifies the ego, and the ego is what we are trying to overcome. It's hard for a rich person to feel the full necessity of depending utterly on God, and yet if you don't feel this, then God is not the presence in your life that he should be. The same goes for status and power. If you have these things, then you cannot help but feel you in some way merit them and that they reflect your authentic self. You will not feel your true debt to God as you should, though you may convince yourself and others that you do. Not feeling a debt to God means not realizing that you are as nothing and everything you are comes from him. These words can trip off the tongue, but realizing them to the depths of your soul is another matter. When you get to heaven, you will have gifts compared to which wealth and status and power will be meaningless. But forgetting this, there are many people who seek wealth, status and power in the spiritual domain. This is typical of the guru figure or the preacher who attracts a large congregation. Or maybe nowadays somebody with a big online presence. All have fallen victim to one of the tests of the spiritual path. It is not just the material version of these things you must renounce, but their transpositions to the spiritual realm too. This doesn't mean you have to don a hair shirt. In our day, out of poverty, chastity and obedience are not generally required, but the safest spiritual path is still to learn to do without worldly acclaim or reward. It's easy to be distracted, and we often overestimate our ability to remain indifferent to the temptations of the world and the ego. Yes, you aren't truly free until you are properly tested, and it may be that your destiny puts you in the position where you have worldly success. At the same time, on the later stages of the path, everything is stripped away and you must deal with the reality of just you without a worldly covering, face to face with God, and then he will withdraw, so it is just you, naked and alone. This is the dark night of the soul, a necessary purifying experience for the soul when it is cleansed of all remaining spiritual vanity and desire for wealth, status and power. Only then can it demonstrate that it merits being given these things as they truly are in the spiritual world. Projection is the new normal. Or, how to infer what they are doing. Bruce Charlton. The handy psychological term projection derives from the nonsensical world of Sigmund Freud's psychodynamics, but, albeit for extremely different reasons than Freud suggested, the actual phenomenon of accusing others of one's own motivations contains a great deal of validity. The reason for projection is that we use ourself, how we see the world, how we are personally motivated, what we are trying to do, as the basic model by which we understand other people and the world generally. Of course, knowing this phenomenon, it is possible to do otherwise, or even do the opposite, but the level of self-awareness in the managerial and leadership class of the West is, well, it is extremely low. The people running things are essentially either bureaucrats, obediently trying to please their bosses, or else psychopaths, self-centered and short-termist types, who don't care enough about other people to realize that they may be differently motivated. Therefore, unless they are continually watched and controlled, they will continually be giving themselves away, will repeatedly be revealing their real and underlying motivations, by their criticisms and accusations against others. That is what I mean by the term projection. Examples abound. During the Birdemic, anyone who objected to the state bureaucrats and media moguls was labeled as a science denier, while the accusers were simply inverting or throwing out a century of medical knowledge concerning epidemics and respiratory viruses. Those who objected to mass pecking with an unnecessary, ineffective and dangerous agent, were labeled as being dangerous gamblers with the public health. Parents who cared about the safety of their children, were labeled as selfish and short-termist, by those whose interests, money, jobs, status, promotion, was enhanced by pushing the peck. When the Fire Nation War came along, the Inversions were legion. The Fire Nation were accusing of provoking the war, deliberate escalation, suffering massive casualties from human wave tactics, of imminently running out of munitions, etc., continuing, all of which were knowingly being done by the side making the accusations. More generally, they accuse anyone who notices, publicizes and opposes the explicit, UN Agenda 2030, Great Reset, and massively documented for decades global plan for totalitarian omni-surveillance and micro-control of everyone except an elite of, implicitly, wise and just leaders, variously, as climate denialist and as a conspiracy theorist. In a nutshell, their projections are an insight into their own natures, their motivations, their intentions. We can easily understand the way that they regard us, and regard the world, by observing that of which they accuse their enemies. Explanatory and contextual note. It might be asked how it is possible to escape from the accusation of projection. After all, it could and will be said that someone like myself is also projecting. You are projecting. No, it's you who are projecting ! Maybe I am projecting even more and worse than them. That is what inevitably, because intrinsically, happens to someone whose explanatory model goes no deeper than psychology, one who uses psychology as their ultimate and bottom line explanatory model. Everything is ultimately reduced to a matter of opinion, which itself reduces to whoever has the greatest power and influence. And we are back to square one. The answer is that we all need to become explicitly aware of our own most basic, metaphysical, including religious, assumptions concerning the nature of reality. In public discourse, we can and should expect that such assumption be made clear. Metaphysical assumptions are the true bottom line and ultimate distinctions, while psychology, or politics, or economics, or whatever, is only ever approximate explanation, only valid insofar as the metaphysical assumptions are known, and are coherent. In this regard, they will not make clear their metaphysical assumptions, and will indeed deny the validity of metaphysics, stoutly maintaining all discourse on a surface and soundbite level of emotive manipulations and assertions about evidence and facts, which they can easily control. Projection is such a problem, here and now, exactly because the mainstream, official, mandatory modern discourse is a futile cycle of ungrounded assertions, that exclude metaphysics, and that operates entirely at the surface and proximate level, and with soundbite, two-step logic. In a nutshell, the leadership/managerial class are themselves slaves to projection because, by assumption, they see no deeper than psychology and its manipulations, and all possible depth is excluded by the anti-spiritual, atheistic materialism/positivism/scientism/reductionism that permeates, and is enforced by, the whole official world. Why Zooey, by JD Salinger, made such an impact. Bruce Charlton. I have written before about JD Salinger's novella Zooey, and how it has fascinated me, off and on, ever since I encountered it in the summer of 1981. Well, I have again been dipping into it, and as usual it has triggered some associations and notions. Zooey struck me as a deep book, when I first read it, as if it might contain the secret of life somewhere embedded. It probably had this effect because this was the first time in my life that I had met with spiritual stuff that really interested and excited me. I was very taken by the way that some of the characters talked about spiritual and religious matters, in a personal and engaged way. This was obviously the most important thing for them, and implicitly the author. Maybe this was the first sense I got of the possibility of a personal and inwardly driven spiritual/religious quest for people of my broad type, people with whom I could identify. The Glass family did plenty of quoting and name-dropping, true, but clearly they were not just repeating what other people had said. And also, they were trying to use these insights in living their lives, giving it their best shot. My reaction was, I now perceive, a kind of recapitulation of the way in which, from the late 1800s and with the emergence of theosophy, many Western people were attracted to the esoteric spirituality and religions of the East, mainly philosophical Hinduism and Zen Buddhism. Mainstream Christianity was largely irrelevant to this quest. It simply did not address the driving motivations of such people. And the way, also, that this Eastern perspective was then brought back and applied to Christianity, because Zooey, and the short story Franny that precedes it, is focused on the Jesus prayer, and the Russian Orthodox book The Way of a Pilgrim, which is about the use of this prayer as the center of a religious life. Zooey is permeated by, and culminates in, what I found at the time to be an appealing positive presentation of Jesus Christ, and that was something I had seldom encountered before. As a child and adolescent I had always found the character Jesus to be uninteresting, alien and irrelevant to my problems and concerns. I can nowadays see that the version of Jesus Christ, the Jesus prayer and Christianity that are featured in Zooey are primarily Hindu/Buddhist/Eastern. For instance, the Jesus prayer is presented as a mantra, pure and simple, and sailing as Jesus is a very different and almost opposite phenomenon from that of what I now regard as real Christianity. Sailing as Jesus is indeed much more like Buddha than the Jesus of the fourth gospel, and sailing as Jesus' concerns and aims are in line with oneness spirituality, rather than being focused upon life after death, salvation, resurrection, and heaven. But this understanding of mine is all retrospective. At the time of reading, my concerns and demands were much like those of the Glass family children. What, then, were these demands and concerns? The big problem for the Glass children is that this mortal life on Earth cannot live up to the aspirations and perceived possibilities of youth. This afflicts all the children we encounter in the main Glass stories, Franny, Zooey, Seymour, and Buddy, the author's persona, and, implicitly the others too. They all seem to have a yearn for ideal of what life could and should be, but later discover that whatever they do, and, between them, the children try a range of strategies. Whatever they try, life just doesn't match up with these intense hopes. Therefore, there is an underlying pessimism about the Glass family saga, even when the specific stories end in an upbeat fashion, upon what seems like an epiphany, an insight, an answer, as do both Zooey and Raise High the Roof Beam, carpenters, the reader senses that it will be a very temporary and partial triumph. This pessimism comes across primarily because the oldest child, Seymour, committed suicide, shot himself with a gun, in a perfect day for banana fish. Yet Seymour was, at least to his family, a spiritual genius, the best of the children, a man we are told was both far advanced and deeply into the actual practice of Eastern spirituality. Therefore, despite that Seymour, like Salinger himself, suffered from combat fatigue, true PTSD, not the watered-down modern usage, as a consequence of prolonged front-line participation in the World War II invasion of Europe, we feel that Seymour should, nonetheless, as a kind of saint, have been able to overcome whatever horrors life threw at him. The background, and deeply sad, implication and conclusion, is that there is no answer to the problem of that between life as it might be and life as it is, because not even Seymour could find one. Seymour's failure in this mortal life casts across all the Glass stories a shadow of the inevitability of failure. The young Glasses may not grasp this, when they are still growing up, extroverted, when life is apparently opening out, and they have the delusional confidence that they will be the first to find this answer. But this will always fail, and will lead either to an abandonment of the spiritual quest, as with Sister Boo Boo, a socially integrated housewife and family woman, or else to a frustration and dismay that increases with age, Seymour, and Buddy. Then there is Waker, who is described as having become a Carthusian monk, vowed to silence for much of the time. It may be that we are supposed to infer that Waker has candidly acknowledged to himself the insufficiency of this mortal life, and looks therefore to the life beyond. My interpretation of Waker is that Salinger saw him more as an Eastern monk than a Christian. One who regards this life as suffering and an illusion, from which we should seek to detach ourselves, awaiting a kind of reabsorption into universal and impersonal divinity. In other words, IMO, Salinger had neither an understanding of, nor belief in, the Christian idea, well, some Christians believe it, that this mortal life and our death are real, necessary steps en route to a state of post-mortal divinity that is personal. So, I agree with Salinger that this mortal life is inevitably insufficient, and I agree with his implicit conclusion that there is no answer to this problem within the scope of Eastern religion. Since, to regard this mortal life as a tragedy of suffering and attachment is not a solution, and to cure our sense of tragic insufficiency with annihilation of the self and consciousness is to avoid, but not to solve, the problem. In conclusion, I continue to regard Zooey as a valuable and honest, as well as interesting and exciting, spiritual story, but I no longer believe it contains the answer to this mortal life. Rather, Zooey and the other glass stories show us what are not the answers. But more than just showing, through participation in these stories, we potentially live out putative answers, and experience for ourselves their noble failures, and they leave us to continue the quest for ourselves and in different directions. A sign of the times, second, third, and fourth-rate trolls. Francis Berger. Trolls rarely leave comments on this blog. All the same, I have noticed a significant deterioration in the quality of the few troll comments I do receive. Trolls from 6 or 7 years ago generally displayed at least an average level of proficiency in their chosen avocation. They came armed with a keen understanding of psychology and fielded an arsenal of underhanded tactics to tempt, lure, manipulate, bully, or goad largely unsuspecting bloggers into excruciatingly long comment exchanges. The discussions they fomented aimed to confuse, subvert, frustrate, incense, infuriate, insult, inflame, or exasperate host authors. Skilled trolls could sink a comments section faster than most older brothers sink their little sisters' fleets when playing Battleship. Though good, the trolls of old were not geniuses or masters, but they often were effective and capable provocateurs. The same does not hold for today's sorry crop of subversives, the bulk of whom have no game of which to speak, no tactic that isn't transparent, no manipulation that isn't glaring, and no insults that succeed at, well, insulting. When confronted by sincere, well-mannered responses, they wither or become ensnarled in the snares they so skillfully set to seize you. These trivial would-be tormentors are also untalented tacticians. 9 times out of 10, they end up making fools of themselves and no one else. Most struggle to rise to the low level of mildly annoying. I take the second and third-rate quality of contemporary trolling as further confirmation of our collapsing civilization. I mean, how far along are we if even the trolls can't be bothered to put in an honest effort anymore? The Biter Bit. William Wildblood. There is a group of people that has been at the forefront of many intellectual advancements over the last 200 years, with both beneficial and harmful results. This group, or some of them, has also been responsible for much of the undermining of Western, and specifically Christian, civilization and culture during that time. This is an undeniable fact, but it's also the truth that dare not speak its name, partly because of the historical suffering of this group and partly because of ideological restrictions, many of which have been promoted by the group themselves. Those who really care for truth and justice are placed in an awkward situation because of this. The fact has to be recognized, but to do so publicly is impossible because of past association. The question I would like to ask is, why is this? Why does this group behave as it does? To begin with, it does because it can. What I mean by that is that it has the freedom to do so, a freedom that historically has been lacking. And it also has the intellectual equipment to do so. Members of this group are among the more talented of humanity, and they use their talent for good and ill. But why do some of them focus it so much on what amounts to moral corruption? Communism, atheism, feminism, anti-white attitudes masked as anti-racism, leftism in general in politics, the degradation of literature and art, the sexual revolution, all these and more feature a significantly high number of members of this group among their leading lights. Why are these people drawn to what amounts to spiritual desecration? I would suggest it is partly on account of what they have suffered at the hands of Western civilization. Is there an element of revenge involved? And partly because the rejection of Christ still lies behind their worldview. Now this group is finding that intellectual and ideological trends it has set up and promoted are being turned against them. Emotions of antipathy and resentment it has fanned into flame are being directed back at them. Here is a classic example of being hoisted by your own petard. One can only hope that experiencing the results of their own propaganda may cause some of them to reflect more deeply. Sometimes God sends us back what we have sent out in order that we may learn the truth. But given that the only way anyone in this position learns the needed lesson is if he looks at his own motivations honestly, that may not be easy. Note, this post is not written in a spirit of antagonism. The group of which I am a member, British Men, has probably done more than most to create the world of materialism in which we live. But God desires to save all souls, and a prerequisite of that is an acknowledgement of both truth and our own fallen nature.